Time for us to begin class. And I'm happy to see each one of you here tonight. We are engaged in a study presently in the Old Testament book of 2 Samuel. And really, as you study 2 Samuel, you are studying the life of King David, one of the great heroes of the Old Testament, of the entire Bible. And David has had some major accomplishments. Now, he will have some major defeats in his life, many of which will be because of personal decisions that he has made. He'll have some great things happen, likewise, because of personal decisions, all connected, as always, with whether or not God was obeyed or disobeyed. And so that which brings honor to us is that which meets God's approval, and He blesses. But then when we go against His will, that brings dishonor to us in some degree or another. Hello, Miss Helen. I'm glad to have you here tonight. And consequences, yes. Consequences. So, we're studying the life of David as we continue through this particular book. And I'm impressed by David's closeness to the Almighty, a man that is identified in Scripture as a man after God's own heart. Now, David has had some ups and downs through the years as he has reigned over God's people. There comes this point in time where David reflects. And we're going to see in our study tonight, primarily focusing our attention on chapter 9 of 2 Samuel, we're going to see how he reflects upon his life, about some promises that he made, commitments and vows that he made. But to introduce the message tonight, I want to tell you something personal about me. And you may can relate to this. I hope that you can. Because I've noticed that there is something that happens. I really have not even talked to Celicia about it. But oftentimes, when it's time to retire at night and I kiss her good night and she goes on off to sleep, I guess that's what she's doing. Gets very quiet and still. And the lights are out, and I, for whatever reason, I just can't go to sleep. And I don't want to get up, but I'm just lying there in bed, and my mind begins to wander, and I start thinking about things that have happened before in my life. Okay? And I think about people that have influenced me. And they're good thoughts. They're happy thoughts. I might be thinking about the ways that God has blessed me. One tremendous blessing, of course, is lying next to me. And the children that live in our house with us. Of course, that's a great blessing. But I also think about, or late at night, about those I've known who've influenced me, and they've already gone on. And we miss them, don't we? But again, these are not morbid thoughts. They're really thoughts that bring a smile to my face, because I'm just thinking about what a pleasure it was to know certain individuals and how I'm looking forward to being with them again in glory. And I think about where God has brought me. I think about what has happened in my life to get me to this point. And though I've had challenges and obstacles, I like to think some success, and I know some failures, God has been with me. And He's blessed me, and I'm thankful. Well, I tell you that because I think probably all of you, at least if you're my age or older, you've had that experience. And maybe that increases as you live and as you continue to grow in your relationship with God. You think about the past. You're also thinking about the future. But David has had a time to reflect on some things. From the time that we studied last week when we when we remembered David giving thanks unto God for his blessings, that beautiful prayer he prayed in chapter 7, we move on into chapter 8 and we find out that David has a number of victories, doesn't he? He has subdued the Philistines, the Moabites. He's defeated a fellow named Hadad-ezer, the king of Zeba. And David, the text says, has been given the respect that God promised him. You know, God promised him earlier that He's going to give him a great name. And David defeats all the enemies around him. He's at peace. And God gives him a great name. To his friends, he has a great name. They respect him. To his enemies, he has a great name. They what? Fear him. All right? And so a good, strong leader ought to have the respect of his friends, and he ought to be able to strike fear in the heart of his enemies. And that's David. And so now it seems that David is in a reflective mood when we get to chapter 9. He begins to think about how God has blessed him. He begins to think about people in his life that have encouraged him, and he thinks about some who have hurt him. Because when chapter 9 opens, he's thinking about Jonathan and Saul. You think sometimes in bed at night, trying to go off to sleep, he might say, I sure do miss Jonathan. Wonder what Jonathan's doing now. You ever think about that with your righteous loved ones who've gone, oh, what are they doing now? I know they must be enjoying themselves. We trust God to save, and we trust God in the life to come, and we look forward to joining those we love one day. But sure do miss Jonathan. No, I remember Saul. Why did Saul have to treat me that way? I don't know. I'd have done anything for him. I tried to be faithful and loyal. He's in a reflective mood, and it causes him to ask this particular question in verse 1. After having reflected upon Jonathan, thinking about how good Jonathan was to him, and thinking about a covenant that he'd made with Jonathan, he says this, Is there yet any that is left of the house of Saul, that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake? Now this shows a man who understands his blessings. He says, I've been blessed, and I was blessed by Jonathan, and now I want to do something that's good for Jonathan's descendants. Is there anyone out there left that's related to Jonathan? Now what happens most of the time when one king takes the throne over another one, when there's a battle for a throne? The one who wins exterminates all of his enemies, right? That's right. And so David is wondering, is there anyone else left out there that's related to Jonathan, that's in the house of Saul? But David's not seeking this person out for vengeance, is he? Just the opposite. He says, I want to help somebody that may be in the house of Saul to show that one some kindness because of Jonathan. Because of Jonathan. Now, I'll tell you, it could be that a young person will find how blessed he is because of his name. It could be that a young man might go somewhere and he desires to get a job. And the boss man says, yeah, I'll hire you. You know why? Your granddaddy hired me a long time ago. I had my first job working at a grocery store over in my hometown. And my parents said, you need to go out there and you need to talk to Leon Mathis. He's the manager of the store. And Leon, my mother said, worked for my daddy, she said, her daddy. My grandfather was in the grocery business. And so when I went to see that man, he already knew I was coming, and he said, your granddaddy hired me a long time ago. And he said, I'm happy I can hire you. Barry Mack. You know what my grandfather's name was? Elbert Mack. He said, your granddaddy used to say right when you was born, so he said he just started working with my granddaddy about the time I was born. He said, your granddaddy always said, that Mack's for me. All right. So you see, one reason he hired me was as a kindness toward my grandfather. So it pays to honor your parents and your grandparents who have done well. And by doing well, I mean who've got a good reputation, who've worked hard. Dan Winkler said this about his father, Wendell. He said, sometimes I have brethren who ask me, it must be hard being Wendell Winkler's son. And he said, brethren, it's not hard being Wendell Winkler's son. He said, I would rather to live up to somebody than down somebody. I'd rather try to live up to somebody. It encourages me to be a better man. He said, I'm proud to be his son. It encourages me to be a better man because what I owe my father. Well, here is David saying, I want to do something good for Jonathan. Now, when he says, I want to show him kindness for Jonathan's sake, that word kindness is too light a word. All of us should appreciate kindness. Love is kind, isn't it? But there's a deeper meaning here. The better word here, I want to show him grace. That's what's meant here. More than just some act of kindness, I want to demonstrate grace to him. It could be that there are any number of deeds he could have done that would have been kind. Our God is kind, but more importantly, He is a God of grace. Grace. And grace has been defined in a number of ways, but the best way to define it is God's unmerited, undeserved favor. Or if you want to remember it in an acrostic form, God's riches at Christ's expense. Grace. That is giving to somebody something though they've done nothing to deserve it. And so David says, I want to show kindness or grace toward someone from the house of Saul because of what Jonathan has done. All right? So, what is grace? Unmerited, undeserved favor. Now, David made a promise to Jonathan out there in the wilderness, out in the woods. A promise that he would not let Jonathan's house be exterminated. Remember that? Even Saul asked for such. Saul came to the conclusion, David, you're going to be the king. Don't destroy all my family. Well, David says, is there anybody left of the house of Saul? Verse 2. We learned there was of the house of Saul a servant whose name was Zeba, I believe is the correct pronunciation. Here is a holdover from Saul's staff. He probably wants to stay under the radar, right? He doesn't want David to know much about him because he had worked for Saul. And so there was this servant, Zeba, and when they had called unto David the king, said unto him, Are you Zeba? And listen to what he says. Thy servant is he. Pay close attention to that word servant. Yes, this is your servant. I've not done anything to undermine you. I am your servant. And so the king says to him something that's rather shocking. He says, "Is there not yet any of the house of Saul that I may show the grace," remember that word grace instead of kindness, "that I may show the grace of God unto him? That I can show unmerited, undeserved favor toward him? Is there anybody?" And Zeba said unto the king, "Jonathan hath yet a son, which is lame on his feet." You could even put there, instead of which, that's inserted by the translators, I believe you could probably put, "but he is lame in his feet." In other words, it seems to me that this man Zeba is probably saying, well, he has a son, but he can't even walk. Hardly at all. Maybe gets around on crutches or something. Yeah. So he's lame in his feet. Now, June mentioned 2 Samuel 4:4. Let's go back over there just a moment to remind ourselves about how this happened. When Saul was toppled from the throne, of course he had died, and he was already toppled from his throne. It was ending, but of course he died, and that brought his kingdom or his reign quickly to an end. And the text says in verse 1 of chapter 4 that when Saul's son heard that Abner was dead in Hebron, his hands were feeble, and all the Israelites were troubled. And Saul's son had 2 men that were captains of bands, and their names are mentioned there. And the Beerothites fled to get them, and were sojourners there until this day. And Jonathan, Saul's son, had a son that was lame of his feet. Now, he was 5 years old when the tidings came out of Saul and Jonathan out of Jezreel, and his nurse took him up and fled, and it came to pass, as she made haste to flee, that he fell and became lame, and his name was Mephibosheth. Now, understand what happened here. If Saul is dead and David's to be the king, what's going to happen to the whole household? They're going to be killed, and they would be. But this nurse, who no doubt loved little Mephibosheth and took care of him, she escapes to save the life of Mephibosheth. And it must have been in her hurry that she trips over rocks or something got in her way, that she lost control of him. He fell, and it permanently damaged his little feet. And as he got older, he still could not walk, except perhaps maybe with a limp or with the aid or assistance of somebody or something. So that's what's happened to Mephibosheth. And all this time, he has been where? In hiding. Now, a lot of time has passed, because we're going to learn that Mephibosheth now has a family. He has a son, doesn't he? Now, the king said that this one Mephibosheth lives in the house of one called Machir, the son of Ammiel, in Lo-debar. Now that word Lo-debar is an interesting place name. Lo means no, and debar means pasture. No pasture, desolate land. Now you would expect that's where he'd be, somewhere out in a desolate place. Why? He's still hiding. From whom? King David. He's part of the household of Saul. Now, the king sent and fetched him out of the house of Machir, the son of Ammiel, from Lo-debar. And now when Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, was coming to David, notice this, he fell on his face and did reverence. Well, there's more than one reason he did that. Not only because that was the proper thing to do in the presence of the king, but he has to be, like Zeba, scared, even more so. Can you imagine when guards from the king's court comes to your house? Your name Mephibosheth? Yes. King David wants to see you. I knew the day was coming. It has finally arrived. I'm going to meet my Maker, right? But he doesn't really know David, does he? And so when Mephibosheth saw David, he fell on his face and did reverence. And David said, Mephibosheth? And he answered, Behold thy servant. Same words Zeba had offered. Behold thy servant. Now, this is a special calling, isn't it? That has come to Mephibosheth because of an act of grace. I want us to pause right here and remember something that David said earlier. He says, Is there yet any or anyone that is left of the house of Saul? That's important. He didn't say, Is there anyone that's qualified? He didn't specify anything about the person. He just said, Is there anyone left? For David, it doesn't matter who he is. This man's going to be the recipient of his grace. Is there a lesson here for you and me? Yes. There was a time when, at the end of the Feast of Tabernacles, as recorded in John 7, where the celebration of the feast is taking place, and it's come to the end, and Jesus is there by the temple, and the text says in John 7 that he lets out a cry. Now, I am of the mindset that whenever Jesus spoke, whenever he preached, he was very calm. They tell us that the best way to preach these days is the conversational style, because people don't like a lot of shouting and hollering at them, all right? One little boy said he wanted to grow up and be a preacher. When he was asked why, he said, if all you have to do is go to church and holler and shout at everybody, it might as well be me instead of somebody else, you know. Well, here is an occasion where Jesus does cry out. John 7. And he cries out, If any man thirst, let him come to me. If what? Any man. That's grace, isn't it? You remember as the Bible closes, Revelation 22, verse 17, the book's almost completed. Bride and the Spirit say, Come, you know. Let everyone that's athirst come, take of the water of life freely. Anyone. That's grace, isn't it? Now, understand this, listen carefully. Understand this about the grace of God. It is given without any favoritism. God's grace, hear me out, is something that's extended to all men, and it's unconditional. Now, salvation unconditional? No. No. But is God's grace extended to all, regardless of whether men accept or reject? Yes. Grace of God that bringeth salvation hath appeared unto all men. That's Titus 2:11. Now, we know there are those who will not accept the grace of God, okay? But the grace of God extended to all men. David says, Is there anyone? He didn't say, Here's what the person has to be like. He just says, Is there anyone to whom I can extend grace? And they said, It is this one named Mephibosheth. So grace is unqualified acceptance that's based on unconditional love. Well, someone was found, and that someone was Mephibosheth. Mephibosheth. Don't you find it interesting also in these passages that we've already read that when Zeba said he's lame in his feet, that David didn't say, Oh, too bad. Isn't that good? David didn't respond in any way. It's like he didn't even hear what he said. He said, But he's lame in his feet. Where is he? Where is he? Could it be that God's grace has been demonstrated in the same way to you and me? The angels may say, you don't want them. The old devil will say, you don't want them. But God so loved the world, didn't He? Where is He? I don't care that He's lame in His feet. Where is He? And so that's grace. It's given to someone who doesn't in any way deserve it, nor can he earn it. Now, this man finds out that David wants to see him. He goes before his presence, and he bows himself before him, and he declares himself the servant. Now, he surely was thinking in his mind, if this is the king, and my grandfather was the former king, remember, he was just a child when all this happened. What he knows about David, I don't know, but I'm sure that he's come of age. All he knows is this. His grandfather was Saul, and he's no longer the king. This man David is the king, and here's what's happened to all your family members. Most of them are dead now. Maybe it's time for this king to exact vengeance on me and my family and get rid of all of us. So this response from David, you know, is going to be an amazing sound in his ears. Grace is always amazing, isn't it? Didn't John Newton write a song, Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound? This is amazing grace, how sweet the sound in the ear of Mephibosheth when David says, fear not, fear not. That's the first thing that God's grace teaches us, isn't it? Fear not, for I will surely show thee grace for Jonathan's sake, and will restore thee all the land of Saul thy father, and thou shalt eat bread at my table continually. So he's going to do something for Mephibosheth because of Jonathan, and likewise he's going to give him all the land of his granddaddy, that is all of his personal estate. He's going to give that to him, not because Mephibosheth deserved it, but because of the covenant that he made with Jonathan and with Saul. He says, I want to show you a kindness. I want to demonstrate grace to you. And so he hears these words from David, I will show you kindness, I'll restore thee all the land, and listen to this last point, and thou shalt eat bread at my table continually. Now God, in His gracious kindness toward us, says that we can sit at His table, right? We can live in His house. That's God's graciousness. David is the king, and he's saying to Mephibosheth, I want you to come and eat at my table regularly. You are going to be a welcome guest. Now listen to this response. This is helpful to you and me. And he bowed himself and said, what is thy servant, that thou shouldest look upon such a dead dog as I am? Dead dog there carries the idea of someone worthless. Who am I? You ever said that in your prayer to God? Who am I? Who am I that I have received such gracious kindness from God? Who am I to receive this? What shall I render unto the Lord for all of His benefits toward me? Who am I? I've thought about this account as I've been studying this week, and I'm wondering what did Mephibosheth think as he looked into the face of David and he saw David smile? Don't we have this idea of one day the Lord smiling upon us as He welcomes us in? David is no doubt smiling. I'm so glad to meet you. I loved your daddy. And I respected your granddaddy. And I want you to come in and be part of my family. That's the spirit of adoption, isn't it? Isn't it true that by God's grace we're adopted into the family of God? God had one begotten Son. That was Jesus Christ, right? And yet we're called the sons and daughters, the children of God, by means of adoption. Ephesians 1 speaks about that. And so here is Mephibosheth being invited into the house of the king to sit down and enjoy a meal with him. It's an act of grace on David's part. Yes, as one of the king's sons. So it's not like this is Jonathan's sons. David's treating him as his own son. So, you know, David evidently was one of those men when Mephibosheth looked into his face, he could see love and kindness and grace and helpfulness. Here is the king, smiling at me, but he wants to help. You know, you can usually from someone's expression, you can find out if that person will help you or not, right? Have you ever stopped ladies and asked for directions? I say ladies because men don't do that, right? We just keep on driving around and well, sometimes we have, right? And we appreciate the one who is kind. There's some people who don't act like they want to help you. I remember when I was a boy, we were around Grant, Alabama, trying to make it out to the caverns out nearby, and we were having a tough time finding an old country boy working at a service station. We pulled up there, and that old boy came out. "Can I help you?" My dad said, "Yes, sir, we're looking at those caverns. How far are they?" He said, "They ain't far." He said, "Here's what you got to do." There's an old country boy, but with a heart of gold, right? "Yeah, y'all have a good time. Ought to be nice out there. Just help you out, you know." Story is told of Thomas Jefferson while he was the president. He and some others were on horseback, and they came to a swollen river. And a wayfarer was nearby, and he was trying to get across, but he didn't have a horse. And so all of Jefferson's men began to go across, and the president was letting them go across first. You know, he's looking out for everybody. And the man wanted to ask somebody to give him a ride across, and he ended up asking President Jefferson. And got across on the other side, and President Jefferson, let the man off the horse, and some of the other fellows said, "Of all the men you could have chosen, why would you pick the president?" He said, "I didn't know that was the president." He said, "All I know is he had a face that looked like he wanted to help somebody." Right? And David must have appeared that way to Mephibosheth. As he says, "You come on into my house. I'm going to do good to you, not because you've deserved anything, but because I loved Jonathan, your father." And so, let's notice, the king called to Zeba, Saul's servant, and said unto him, "I've given unto thy master's son all that pertained to Saul and all his house. Thou therefore and thy sons and thy servants shall till the land for him. Thou shalt bring in the fruits that thy master's son may have food to eat. But Mephibosheth, thy master's son, shall eat bread always at my table." Now Zeba had 15 sons and 20 servants. And what is David saying? Because you are the servant to Mephibosheth, here's how you're going to be blessed. And Mephibosheth, even more than you, because he's going to sit at my table, but you're going to till the ground, and your family will eat off the land. Hey, it's working out for him too. And Mephibosheth had a young son, whose name was Micah, and all that dwelt in the house of Zeba were servants unto Mephibosheth. So Mephibosheth dwelt in Jerusalem, for he did eat continually at the king's table, and here it is again, and was lame on both his feet. Now, let's think about this just for a moment. Who was sitting at that table from time to time? David the king. Who else? Well, what about Amnon? Oh, clever Amnon. He might have been sitting there sometime. Yeah. Oh, here comes the fellow that's just stolen the hearts of all the girls. What's his name? Absalom, here he comes, sitting down. Nose stuck up in the air just a little bit, you know. Here's Absalom. At some point, sitting at the king's table would be a young man who was always studying, but he'd take a break. His name was Solomon, right? There's a daughter, Tamar. Oh, she's beautiful. Here she is at the table. They're royalty. They're royalty. They all sit at the king's table, okay? What do you hear? You hear the clump of a fella who's just barely able to walk coming down the hallway. And he goes in there and he takes his seat too. His name is Mephibosheth. And as one writer has said, his feet are covered with a tablecloth of grace. All right? I'll tell you, we have these dinners over here from time to time to honor preachers, and that's fine. Maybe to honor elders, that's fine. We never should be offended because we're honoring certain people. Sometimes I think we ought to have a dinner, though, to honor the one who gets very little attention. Mephibosheth was welcome there at the table. And you look in God's Hall of Fame of Faith, you read about one named Jacob, and it speaks about his faith, and it talks about Jacob leaning upon his staff. Why was he leaning upon his staff? Why is that put there? I guess Abraham and Isaac, they had a staff. But Jacob at one time wrestled with the Almighty, didn't he? And to humble him, what did the Almighty do? He took that knee socket, knocked it out of joint. He had to limp the rest of his life. But here we are seated at the table of the Most High, and there are the heroes that we have studied all through our lives. And we seem to be so insignificant when we consider ourselves next to them. But because in God's house we are like Mephibosheth, because of His grace, God provides us a seat at the table too, doesn't He? All children of God. Wonderful, wonderful account here of Mephibosheth, who was blessed by David because of that beautiful, beautiful word, grace. Thank you.